Hello, everybody. It's Safsom. I'm your host. This is the Quadratum Podcast, which is ideally going to be a weekly podcast about typology, philosophy, religion, several topics. We type primarily using the cognitive typology or CT system. And in this episode, we're going to discuss how we came to the CT system, how our types in CT relate to our types in other systems, and whether or not we relate to our types in the CT system. I'll start off by introducing myself first. I'm Safsom. I got into typology in 2020 during COVID, and although I'd been a little bit before that, and I usually got INTP on tests, but this was based on sort of very unrigorous analysis of, me being sort of disengaged from a lot of daily type social situations. The typing wasn't really resistant to my own, like cognitive biases and so on. Like it didn't really track how my behavior changed over time. And overall, it just wasn't a very good typing. So I then stumbled into socionics, where I don't think I was able to find an adequate typing. And then finally into CT, where I was typed initially as a double extroverted NITE, which appeared to be a fitting type within the premises of the system, which is sort of very cognitivist in orientation. And I've sort of been intertwined with the community since, and I've been interested in doing this podcast. Today on the podcast with me, I have Ren, Lapis, and Azraella, who will all be introducing themselves. Ren, do you mind going next?
Not at all. It's a great pleasure to be on this podcast. I have a YouTube channel. Some people might know me from my YouTube channel, which is my name and my surname, Reno Contini. I guess my claim to fame, which is small, is a book on the INFJ personality, which is kind of the only book of its kind that tries to situate the discussion of the INFJ type within a sort of philosophical background, talking about, providing a kind of existential analysis of the modes of being associated with the INFJ consciousness. So it's kind of a tall order, but and since then I've kind of evolved to have this kind of I don't know how to put it, but I suppose it's sort of a status, so to speak, as someone who speaks a lot about INFJ topics. Now, the interesting thing is that over time, people started suggesting cognitive type to me, voltology, the practice of voltology to me, and I became very interested in it for reasons that are very similar to those of Safsom. Sparser system, more systematic system, a system where it's easier to see the weaknesses instead of all these more gooey, mushy other frameworks where if there appears to be a discrepancy, it's always somehow is explained in terms of something else. So it's a bit like an extension from astrology, except not as bad as astrology. But in CT, you cannot do that as much because even though it is not, I think we all agree on this at this stage, a completely scientific system, you can really sense quite quickly when you get into it that at least it has this ethos and seeks to be, and hopefully at some stage will be. So the irony being, of course, that me, with all my INFJ cred, is, it turns out I'm not an INFJ in the CT system. I am an ENFJ, or I should say FENI, because even though people might think that INFJ and IFE or ENFJ and FENI are the same, they're not exactly the same. That in itself is an interesting topic for discussion, what do you think? But at least my viewpoint on this, that they don't quite capture the same things. But either way, the typing by body language and by visual cues seems to be, there seems to be a consensus with which I myself agree that I probably qualify more as a FENI in CT and not as an NIFE. All with the consensus, or some people disagree, but seems to be that I have all functions conscious. I think that if I do not have all functions conscious, likely the one that I do not have conscious is SE. I probably have it conscious, but I say maybe I do not. Either way, having the double introversion is probably a nice way of explaining why I would identify with INFJ in MBTI. If I was, let's say, a double extroverted FENI with FE and SE conscious only, then it would be very unlikely I could identify with INFJ. But that's a really interesting finding, and I think that's also the power of cognitive type. Something that is really interesting about it is it challenges your intuitions, and it gets you to think about yourself and how you're typed just in a different way. I identify as an INFJ because I think it captures my type best in the Jungian system, but in CT, in some sense, CT is more precise as well, in addition to being simpler and more agile. Because FEI with all four functions conscious actually could potentially be more precise from the point of view of a scientific model, anyway. So yeah, that was a long bit of rambling, but contextualizes why I've been interested in this. I'm on my channel. I've talked about voltology and CT before. The reason why I'm interested in it is because I think that in terms of like models of personality that have a future, other than those that either are short-lived or are just some more or less creative rehashes of what Jung said. Yeah, CT has a future, and we don't know where this future will go, but at least it has a future, and there's lots of energy that goes into trying to, to make it progress, and I find that exciting.
Yeah, thank you for your remarks, Ren. We'll definitely be discussing the differences between CT and other systems in this episode. Likely when it comes to the point of, discussing how we relate to our types, that'll almost certainly come up, especially about its relative simplicity. But I'd like to hear what Az has to say, and then Lapis. But let's do it in that order. Az, what do you have to say about your journey into CT?
So I started my journey in the time of COVID as well, just as you did. Actually, we actually met at the same time. I think you maybe went into CT maybe a month before me, so it was around the same time. And basically, I was starting my MBTI or typology journey in high school when I was just going by the basic dichotomies of I or E or J or P, and I didn't really dwell into cognitive functions that much. So at my third year of college, which is like before COVID started, I started delving more into cognitive functions and Jungian typology and other systems as well. So I was watching a lot of YouTube videos. I've been into OPS for some time. And I stumbled upon one video about like typing people with visual body cues, and that instantly struck me as very intuitive, because I do believe that people expose their cognition via body movements. Like, it's pretty rational to expect that if you're in some extroverted type, you will be more extroverted outwardly. You will have open body language. So I joined the Discord server about 3 years ago, and I've been typed NIFE first. I've been typed NITE, and because I didn't really have the knowledge of CT as I do have now, I thought that was quite reasonable typing for me, because EE is what I've been associating in other systems as well. I've been typed INTJ or ENTJ in other systems, so I didn't really question my typing at the time. And like a year after that, I've been retyped as NIFE, polarized, which means that I have my first functions, which is NI conscious, obviously, and I have my last functions, which is SC conscious. So I don't really want to go into my type journey, how I got typed NITs and NIFE and so on like that. Maybe that could be discussed later on or like that. But yeah, I've been typed previously in other systems as INTP, INTJ. It was really random, and I couldn't really find consistency between those typings. Like, it was very open to interpretation. There was not solid ground for anything but how people interpret your behavior, or will they take your behavioral if they will take your behavior as valid points, which is kind of close for me, because we are not measuring, we are not behavioral system, we are cognitive system, and instead of looking purely face on our behaviors. We should look what drives those behaviors. So that's the reason I'm not really agreeing with socionics, because socionics for the majority of part is just measuring behavior, and that's part of CT that I find really interesting. That it delves, especially when you later build up your knowledge about psychology of CT as well. So I've been rambling so far, but maybe we can like deepen the discussion later on. But I'm finished for now.
Yeah, before we do, I'd just like to hear Lapis's remarks on his typing and so on.
Yeah, so I got into CT about 2 years ago after probably a 15-year gap in my interest in typology. And when I first came, I don't remember how exactly I found the CT website, but I ended up on the Discord server, and everyone said Delta, definitely. And as after several videos, it became evident that I was PI lead, and probably standard development. Then, I was pretty complacent with that for like over a year, and then one of my friends from the server started doubting the Delta typing and paid for me to get a report from Auburn, and the result was SIFE with JI integrated, so double introverted. And it makes sense. I relate to the typing. The double introversion, people probably wouldn't guess from my my text personality that I'm double introverted, but when they see me in video or in person, then it's pretty evident. I'm pretty quiet person normally. So yeah, that's the story of my typing.
Yeah, so a theme that we see consistently here, it seems, is that CT is kind of an interesting system because its definitions and the way that it's organized theoretically, with energetics, so on, so like the way the axes work and consciousness, it's like a highly cognitive system. Like everything is defined in terms of information processing. Socionics is actually also defined this way, but the way practitioners like Gulenko type people is often based on sort of behavioral heuristics. And of course, the disagreements that occur most frequently in socionics communities is about which behavioral heuristics to apply. They can never agree on that. And of course, it's difficult to agree on that when there's so many extrapolations you can make from those sort of imperfect natural language type definitions. In CT, you don't really have that problem, which is to say you don't actually make any extrapolations at all from the structure of the system when typing. You sort of just make the natural extrapolation that a person's cognition manifests a little bit in how they move or how they conduct themselves and how their body language is. So, there are four energetics. There's PI, introverted perception, JI, introverted judging, JE, extroverted judging, PE, extroverted perception. This is all defined in my document. I've linked that in the bio, in the description for this video, if you want to read it. But there's kind of an interesting sense of being able to read all four of these and maybe relate to parts of all of them, and then being typed something completely different and coming to realize that whatever, your visuals express may actually be quite fitting of you. Which is to say, I don't think people generally come to fully accept their CT typings per se. Like, it's not like they're submitting to it like it's some sort of absolutely correct cult. You, of course, have the choice to reject the typing if you like and leave the community. But I think after doing some introspection with a voltological type, I have noticed that people tend to come to a sort of consensus with it or, understanding with it. Like, even if they say something like, okay, this doesn't align at all with my types in other systems, they can at least say this seems to be an accurate description of my cognition. And I think a part of the reason for this is because the voltology method just assigns something to you, and it kind of just gives it to you to think about. So in that way, it actually kind of encourages very objectively grounded introspection, because a type determined entirely based on your body language is, it's kind of indisputable unless you have disputes about how you're going to assign the signals. There's no disputes about subjective precepts or your phenomenology or whatever. So your phenomenology kind of has to wrestle with the fact that this has been assigned to you and sort of resolve the tension within it, which is why I think so many people come to sort of relate to their CT types at least like some level. Like they can see the assignment fitting. And it's not like a random assignment, like an astrological assignment. It's we don't know if it's verified yet, because we haven't tested these things. Although the preliminary studies do show that there's correlations between types, do show that there's a low level of arbitrariness, with rather low level of signal mixing that I've found in my studies. But yeah, I mean that's, I think, part of the reason that being typed in CT and figuring out whether or not you relate to your type is so unique. Because you're just wrestling with something someone gives you. Like in the socionics world or MBTI world, you can always find another practitioner or quiz that's going to give you something else and give you a little bit of leeway. But there's absolutely none of that in the cognitive type world. But that was my unique experience with it, and I can get more elaborative and specific about that. But
Yeah, I would agree with what you said, that in other systems it's very practitioner dependent. And in city, basically, what struck me really fast and strong about city is that when you get into the system, you can learn how to type people pretty fast, and you can actually see the typing process and how it goes, and it's very transparent. There is no leeway, as you said, in other systems. So when I first got into my journey, I started typing people within a week, because I already memorized the whole signal spreadsheet, and of course there are people who type better, there are people who type worse, but at the end there is a satisfying conclusion for everyone. Everyone agrees on certain signals. So there is no drama about typing, or in some cases with high signal mixing there is the case, but most people do not present high signal mixing. It is present in very low amounts. So yeah, that's what I wanted to build up anew.
Lapis, Ren, do you guys have anything to say about this?
Well, I mean, in terms of the appeal of CT and the relationship that people who have been exposed to CT have, I think I agree with what's been said. I agree with Saf's intuitions as well, that I think people relate. It's almost impossible to relate to the CT type that you are given in the same way that you relate to another type that you get in another system. And it's obviously the whole objectivity dimension. I think that someone who is interested in knowing what their type is in CT will, when they're given a type, and particularly if they're given a type that doesn't look like, it doesn't sound like it's the same type, you're INFJ, INFP, because it's actually not super common. It's by no means the rule. I mean, Az was talking about how she was oscillating between INTJ and ENTJ. Turns out she's anti-FE. You said, at least for a good bit of time, you were identifying with INTP. Well, too bad, you're not INTP in CT. And Lapis, I think identified as INTP at some point as well. I could be wrong, but I would very much doubt that he would identify as ISFJ. because I mean the whole SI thing is one of the most original things about CT when we're talking about how people outside of the CD world within the young world think of ISFJs or ISTJs and SI in general. So I think that a lot of the time it's like I think a lot of people think, it seems to me, prefer not to take too much of an interest because they're almost afraid of where that could lead them. You know, I think that there's a quote by Nietzsche that really reminds me of that, and maybe it's a little bit pompous, but it really relates to typology. You know, because we all know that typology has a certain navel-gazing, narcissistic elements to it. It might be harmless, might be non-harmless, might be this, might be more extreme, might be less extreme, but there is that. And, you know, Nietzsche says sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. You know, and I mean, basically, you can really apply that to how people either take CT seriously or decide not to take an interest. Because once you make that step, then there's no coming back. You will never forget that you have been objectively typed a certain way, and people might try to deny that, or people might challenge the theory. I mean, if they challenge the theory, that's fine. They do it on the theory's term. But a lot of the time, when people start trying to, you know, when they challenge the theory only once they've been typed, it obviously looks like they're trying to rationalize away not having been given the type that they were secretly hoping for. Like, CC is the only system that does not care about your feelings when it types you. Because, you know, that really is that. I thought the point about the practitioner dependence that both Az and Saf made, I mean, that's an excellent point. Something that I said in the video before, I think, is that there seems to be people that keep circling from model to model, from practitioner to practitioner. In other words, they keep going from bank accounts to bank accounts of the practitioner. You know, they keep paying people, they get a type, and they're never satisfied. But I think that a lot of the time, once you get to CT, a lot of people seem to lose interest in looking at for the advice of those practitioners, at least as regards that type. Maybe they'll take an interest in the Enneagram because that captures something different. But that says something, I think, quite interesting and quite substantial about CT, is that there is something final about it. And it does, I think it's like, if people can accept what they're typed in CT, like, if they don't accept it, they'll continue in that permanent circle. But if they can accept it, you can actually kind of find peace. You can find peace in a way that links, and I think that probably is linked to some kind of truth, some kind of virtue in CT. So, I forgot to mention, but when I started my typology journey, that was in 2016, I got INFP first, then I got INTP, then I got INTJ, and then I got INFJ. I'm sure because I made myself get INFJ. I mean, that's what happens, even if it's unconscious, when you take a test. So yeah, none of these are fitting my CT type, and that's so interesting that CT gets you to reflect on those questions. So I think that at some level, I think that the success of CT is going to be dependent on becoming a full-fledged theory that has respectability as something objective at a further level, but it also will depend on the collective behavior of people and what are they trying to get from the system. As long as their egos are very tied to what type they are, they're going to be either not wanting to go there or they're going to be predisposed to questioning it. You know, so it's a because again, it's a lot of people take an interest in typology because they like to inject their own selves as part of the typology process, and CT just deprives you of that. It doesn't give you that.
Yeah, and in a sense, in a sense, it's very difficult to like think about typology that way because for most people, it's like an introspection activity. It's something you do subjectively to think about your own choices.
Yeah.
You answer questionnaires, you try to be consistent as possible, but ultimately, there reaches a point where when you get invested enough in it, most people will start to be aspirational about it. Like, and I think a lot of this has to do with like moral leanings that people have. But people's aspirational types really do seem to be based on what they expect of themselves at a moral level. And getting the wrong type for someone, not only, it can be either offensive to them because, they don't want to be identified with certain traits that they consider bad or immoral.
We've all seen that. Yeah, we've all seen that. People getting really offended.
Yeah, people get really offended by it. But in CT, there is that sort of finality to it. This is not to say, of course, that the theory is without its flaws, however. One of the biggest flaws, of course, is I think the lack of, especially in Model 2, there is a lack from the official documentation of a sort of human-centric phenomenological component, which is to say you can be typed something, and you as a beginner might have the very reasonable question of, okay, I've been typed this, how do I find out if this typing fits me? Because, of course, the dry answer is your voltology fits this typing, therefore this typing fits you. That is like the definitionally correct typing. But of course, when we think of a typing fitting us, we think of it fitting our thought patterns, we think of it fitting our behavior, we think of it fitting our mood, we think of it sort of explaining certain maybe larger scale tendencies that have taken place within our lives. And I think as of its current state on the wikis and whatnot, CT does not offer very much infrastructure for you to do this in a sort of hands-off way. And of course, there's always the possibility to say, like take the harsh road, go on, study it yourself. And because it is possible, I think all four of us in this voice chat have kind of extensively looked through the materials, the definitions of the functions. We've contributed and formulated to them. But the fact that a lot of us have had to make original intellectual contributions for the theory to be able to sort of make sense for us, I think tells us a lot about the current state of the, relatability gap with the theory. And that's part of what motivated the start of this podcast. Because we have lots of individuals on Quadratum, our server, who have been typed in CT and who do relate to their type, who have thought deeply about the sort of phenomenological component of it and how it all fits together. And I think a lot of us are able to explain it in words. And I think something else about CT that needs to be acknowledged is that an essential part of the typing process in CT after voltology, as I sort of touched on earlier, is the sort of rational introspection that you need to conduct. So CT is not like other systems like socionics where you can directly apply the definitions of the functions towards typing. That is not the valid typing method, right? Because that's not the hypothesis that it's testing. The closest thing that we've gotten to that is Auburn's energetic survey. And interestingly enough, the results that people get on their energetic surveys almost never actually seem to line up with what their developments actually are. Because I think that kind of falls to the same like aspiration trap that a lot of other typology falls to. But when people think critically at a definitional level about what each function is, so for instance, what PI is or what JI is or whatnot, I think it's almost the case that when you look at the definition, when you deconstruct it, right, at a very deep level, when you're deconstructing it as you would just deconstruct a logical idea, it kind of just begins to fit like a glove. Like you start noticing the patterns in your own thought. So the aim of this podcast, I hope, is to kind of guide this sort of deconstruction. So in future episodes, we'll probably be going through each function one at a time. Not from the definitional way, not in the definitional way that Auburn does in his videos. Those videos are great. They're a good starting point along with my document for checking out, although Auburn and I do have some theoretical disagreements. They're a good starting point for checking out how each function manifests, at a very definitional level. But if you look at the sort of phenomenological analysis present in those videos, I don't think it's super deep. Like it kind of goes to the extent of, oh yeah, these are JI leads. If you contrast TI leads to FI leads, you'll find that many of them are into makeup, and this is because they're into meticulousness and perfection. And more conceptually oriented PI lead, like our own, the good Thana on our server, who has described herself as a perfectionist, might have been like, oh, I am perfectionistic. I relate to JI. And that's not wrong. She has JI conscious. But, according to voltology, she's not a JI lead. But I hope that these videos will sort of foster that more deconstructive approach, like sort of approaching the type you're given as an object to deconstruct. Because being assigned the voltology is one thing, deconstructing it outwards is another thing. There are some former members of the CT community who have complained that CT typings don't align with other systems, and this means that there must be something wrong with CT. But I don't think that's the case. The reason the typings in the other systems are consistent is because your aspirations are consistent. As a moral agent, you probably have certain ideas that you're consistently attached to and other ideas that you consistently reject or are not attached to. And so, I think that sort of not only is the typing you're given objective, but your method of self-analysis respective to it also has to be objective. You have to be able to sort of access your thought patterns. And this is not an easy thing to do. Some people don't even think they're like objective thought patterns that you can, separate from your moral aspirations and do it. But the way CT's definitions are structured, I think, can allow for this sort of introspection. So I kind of want to know everyone's thoughts on it there. Did you have to do this type of introspection that I'm describing here to come to sort of relate to or accept your CT type? What type of analysis did you think you had to do? Because I think to accept my NITE typing, I certainly did.
Yeah, I think you were typing ENTJ firstly in CT, right?
Yeah.
You typed yourself lead. Yeah. So, and when I remember you from that time, you were very, very pushy, straightforward. You were trying to really present as TE lead, like you were trying to fit the mold, right?
Yes.
So, so when I first started with CT, I was typing NI lead in other systems, so it wasn't as hard for me, right? But and one do have to have like really open mind to get into CT, because it requires you to break the norms of your previous typings. And I was very how do you say? I was very pleasured with my NIT typing up until people started suggesting FE for me. So this was actually the first time that I read the FE description and kinda deconstructed my my behavioral patterns, deconstructed what I'm actually going through, and it matched more with FE than TE on the very ontological level of FE function as it is presented in CT. So yeah, there is a long journey with C, definitely, and for the most people it's not easy, because most people want really quick typing that will validate their subjective views of themselves, which is basically what you talked about.
Yeah, I think I was in a privileged position when it came to introspecting toward accepting my type. Because again, to move from special hyper rare snowflake to less rare, I mean, you'd imagine it would be hard for me, like I must have been like, oh, when I wrote this book. But actually it was easier. I suspect Robert, or I should say Lapis, is going to echo this, but the reason why I'm saying this is I'm older, I'm a bit world weary, I've been around, I've gotten time to also get bored with my type. So in a way, like the prospect of being something else was also the prospect of being something new. It was a way to explore a potential new identity. Now, maybe a truer identity in other ways, at least in an objective sense, maybe not in a subjective sense, because again, I think there's merit to the Jungian system. But so I think that it's something that I said before to Auburn, the main architect behind CT. I said to him that if someone had made me discover CT like a year after I started my channel, I would have had a crisis. I would have had a meltdown. Like I would never have possibly accepted this. So I want to be humble about this. I think people who have trouble and who have difficulty detaching themselves enough that they can accept their CT type, I feel for them in some sense. It's not easy, and I took it I was smart. I think I was aware of CT a few years before, but I think I was intelligent enough that I said to myself more or less unconsciously, I'll wait until I've got bored with my INFJ type so that I wouldn't be upset if it's enough. But yeah, jokes aside, it has also obviously then created, because the theory itself, for anyone who is willing to put a bit of time exploring it, is well crafted, is thoughtful. There's no attempt at being, no attempt at sort of manipulating people into thinking that it possesses the truth. It's trying to be rational, it's trying to be transparent. So because of that, I think that I took it seriously enough that I did start to explore and introspect, and I started to see all the ways in which I used FE a lot more than I used to think, and that in itself is a big success. That in itself is a big success of the theory, because I was able to apply to my narrative of how I explain my behavior in a lot of different situations. My relationship to my father, why I relate to him on a certain level that I was never able to explain before, and why it's so hard for my brother. FE, in the Jungianism, in MBTI, people tend to see me as an INFJ because FE is actually not very developed. Right? So it might seem crazy for someone who's been so long in CT that they see my FE everywhere in my body language. But actually, from the perspective of MBTI, it's far from intuitive. And I think that's an example of where CT is clearly bringing some, in terms of, again, like explaining my reality, is bringing some benefits, because it's clearly added a variable that wasn't existing before and just makes a huge amount of sense. And it's all the more fascinating that appeared initially purely on the basis of looking at my body language. So my introspection was actually quite good, I think. I really enjoyed introspecting, particularly in relation to the FE function. I still am not sure about this whole SC business, for example, as regards but I'll stop here. Maybe we can explore that in a later episode, because it seems that SC is conscious or integrated, as the term often is, in me. But as much as I find it very useful in terms of understanding and explaining my worlds and how I interact with the world through this addition of and revalorization of FE, I'm still struggling with seeing how SE is also contributing. But that's for, like I said, for a later episode, where we start also talking a bit more about the energetics and how CT understands these, because obviously SI and CT means something quite different from what it means in the MBTI community, and that applies to the other functions too. There's overlap, but it's not quite the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's certainly, like, if you're adding more variables, if you're explaining something that hasn't been explained before, it's valuable, and I think it's worth accepting.
Absolutely.
And it's it's totally intuitive that people don't want to explore it or look into it because of the density and difficulty of the material. But the hopes in this podcast is that we're simplifying it for everybody. So in the description here, we've dropped a link to join our Discord server, if you would please to do so. We've also put a link to the theory document, so you can have a read over it before our next episode. I think this is a good place to wrap up the episode for today. We talked a little bit about how each of us relates to our types. As for some closing remarks that I have, it's certainly a system with a future. It's also certainly a system with its flaws. But I think in the end, the point of every typology system is to either accurately explain cognition or behavior, and explain and sort of precisely outline which dimension of it that it is explaining. Right? It's not just explanation, it's also explaining like exactly what it is explaining. And I think when it comes to systems and what they explain, the what of what is being explained is perhaps the clearest in CT, which is the way you are oriented towards mentally organizing objects and how that impacts your social interaction style. But we will dig into this more when we start discussing the energetics next episode. Next episode, we will be discussing judgment in CT versus judgment in other systems. This might be pretty close to what you see in other systems, but I hope this podcast was instructive. I hope it was entertaining, and I look forward to seeing everybody next week. Thank you very much, Ren, Azraella, Lapis. Right.
Thanks. Cool.
Yeah.
Looking forward to next week.
Yeah, see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.